Hello and welcome to another episode of the Modern Divorce Podcast. This is Billy Tarasio, your host, and I am back with Darren Colburn. Say hi, Darren.
Hey, how's it going, everyone?
Today we are going to dish on Kellyanne, George, and Claudia Conway. There is a lot of information here, a lot of facts, and a lot of different legal issues and different ways that it could be applied to what our family court clients and potential clients might be going through. So today I'm super excited to talk about this. Darren, can you give us a little bit of background on these players and the situation?
For those of you who are not familiar, both Kellyanne and George are kind of high-profile political players. Kellyanne was well, no, not in-house counsel, but she was counsel to President Trump and a very, very close advisor to Trump during his presidency. She also was instrumental in helping him get elected and strategizing around that in 2015, 2016. So she's been very closely tied with Donald Trump for most of her career. And then George is an attorney based in D.C. He's a conservative attorney, but also a huge critic of Donald Trump, and was involved in the founding of the Lincoln Project, which was kind of like a conservative attack on Trumpism. You've probably seen some of their ads. And in the middle of all this is their daughter, right? Claudia, who's 16 years old and has kind of risen to internet fame on TikTok and also Instagram, posting videos, and kind of, about her parents, about politics, all that. And so she's kind of become viral. And over the last couple of weeks, things have exploded. She has for a while made allegations of abuse by her parents. And remember, these are two very high profile people. She has like posted videos of her mother yelling at her in a very concerning way. Um, and also within the last couple weeks, a nude video or a nude photo of Claudia, who again is a minor, was posted from her mother's account. She originally came out, Claudia posted that she thought her mother did it on purpose, and she was basically going to use, she took the photo from her phone to blackmail her in the future. She thought maybe it was hacked, or her mother did it on purpose, and said that her mother was going to go to jail. And then a couple days later, she kind of like, there was this kind of hostage style type post where she's like, I'm I'm coming up. Nobody's telling me to tell this, but I no longer think my mom did it. In terms of posting the photo, and now my understanding is they're being investigated by Child Protective Services where they live. So it's all very interesting, and I think a framework that would be interesting for our discussion is like, what would we do if Kellyanne came into our office, if George came into our office, or if somebody was asking us to advocate for this child, just kind of based on the information that we have available. Obviously, as we say every time, this is all speculative. Anyone we refer to is fictional, even if they have a resemblance to a real person. I'm just kidding. But anyway, we're only going off of what we read on the internet. So take everything with a grain of salt, but it's very interesting to say the least.
That it's a great idea. So we've got so many different issues here. We've got Claudia, who's internet famous. She's TikTok famous. She's gone viral. She has been very vocal in her allegations that her mother is abusive and pleading, somebody get me out of here, posting videos that appear to be quite abusive. And CPS has investigated, the police have investigated. She's also filed for emancipation. I'm not sure if you covered that part. So we should talk
I
about,
did not mention that.
yeah,
No.
she's filed for emancipation. Um, let's start. I love your idea of how would we advise and analyze on behalf of each of these three very distinct people. So let's talk about that, and let's start with Claudia. Claudia comes into your office and she says, I want to be emancipated. What do you tell her?
Well, The first step I think would be getting her a legal representative other than counsel. So somebody like a guardian ad litem is what we would call it here in Arizona because she's a minor. And so it would be difficult to communicate with her without her parents present, unless she has a legal representative. So that would be the first step. Somebody who's, she's not an adult, so somebody who's advocating for her best interest. And then I would get details about what occurred and when, um, and what her concerns are, in terms of, in terms of the abuse of her parents. I'd also look at getting some kind of expert involved, to do a home study, to talk to the parents, talk to her, look at medical records, look at social media posts. That's the weird thing about this is there's a, these are, people that are very much in the public eye, and I got to imagine there's got to be a lot of text messages back and forth between her and her mother. A lot of there's all kinds of social media posts. So I would want to see and look at all of that.
Hmm. Okay, that's really interesting. So I don't think that I would look for a different legal representative. I think that I would be okay representing her, especially in a direct emancipation. And she's got a couple issues going on. To get emancipated, what you're asking the court to do is to remove parental responsibility and allow you to act as an adult. And now, one of the things that you mentioned, I think, or at least intimated at, is that really what she wants? Does she really want her parents not to be responsible for her? Or is she instead looking to sue her parents to have them financially support her so she can move out? That may be what she's seeking. And figuring out
Yeah,
her intention is going to be pretty, and letting her know what her options are. Like, do you really want to be on your own without parental support? Because to get emancipated, you have to tell the court how you're going to support yourself.
yeah. I think I suspect you're right. I think that, she probably I don't know what her plan would be to support herself. And she probably doesn't want to, or is capable of doing it on her own. I would also be concerned about all of her social media posts, um, because, not the ones that talk about abuse, but she's developed a presence that prior to the abuse allegations could kind of come off as like a bratty, whiny, teenager, and not necessarily lending itself to somebody who's, mature enough to take care of themselves. But again, that could also be a reflection of whatever she's experiencing at home. Um, so suing her parents may be, um, maybe not a bad option. I guess my question is, and I don't know the answer to this, but are you allowed to talk to her? Uh, or do you have to talk to her parents? I've never done, an emancipation, so I'm not sure how that works. But that would be a concern that I would want to look into before I even talk to her up front.
Children can have attorneys, and we know that because whenever children are charged with crimes, they are given attorneys, and the attorneys
Right.
have to work directly for the child. The parents don't get to call the shots. The child's the actual attorney, which is strange because typically they don't have the ability to contract or even enter into a contract with
Right.
an attorney. But we almost become their guardian, or the same way we have a duty of loyalty, and we almost become a representative of whoever we are representing. The same is true for children. We would really want to talk with her about her options. um, and maybe she would be making money by being a social media influencer, but
Oh, I'm sure she could. I mean, there are, I'm sure, a slew of advertisers that would love to get her uh, to co-sign on their product.
yeah, and you know I don't know what's going on in that household. We know that things are bad. We know that there's a ton of tension, that there's tension between obviously mom and dad, that there's huge amounts of tension between the daughter and the mother. One possible claim she may have against her mother. So she said She verified that the topless photo that was posted on Twitter of her or from her mother's account was her. She
Hmm.
confirmed it was her. It was a selfie. She said that she was pretty sure her mother had seized the photo to use against her and that maybe she had accidentally posted it. And she said, "You're going to effing jail."
Yep.
Now, we know the police have investigated, but whether or not the police press criminal charges is different from whether Claudia may have a claim against her mother for damages for posting a nude photo of her.
Yeah, and that's interesting. So because I don't know, maybe I'm a little bit too optimistic, but it's really really difficult for me to envision her her anyone's parents really doing that on purpose. It certainly happens, but these are people. Maybe I'm giving her the benefit of the doubt too much because she is in the public eye, um, and we've seen enough from the actual yelling to know that her at least portions of her behavior at home doesn't really match up with what you'd expect. But it's still difficult for me to envision her doing that on purpose. Like I don't know what the point would be, and it is also very common for famous people to get hacked, which is something that her daughter said. So I think that's just fascinating to me because um, how do you prove whether she was hacked, whether she did it on purpose? Because it seems outlandish, right? Which I think is a challenge for Claudia.
Well, right. And then
But it's also happened. I mean, there's no dispute about that.
it did happen.
Right.
And if we believe Claudia's first instinct was that it was an accident. So
Right.
let's say that you as a parent, let's say you as a parent um, find that your child is taking nude selfies of themselves
Right.
and you screenshot that on your phone or you forward that to yourself because it's something that you want to have. You don't want it to delete it. You want a record of that for whatever reason as a parent. And let's say, let's start right there. Is
That's a
that
good question. Yeah.
is that child porn?
I would say yes. And I don't have kids, but so I'm not. I mean, take that for what it's worth. But I would imagine that if that were my child, I would immediately delete it. I can't think of any reason why you would want to keep that for records or posterity. But you actually have kids, so how would you feel if you found something inappropriate of that nature? I mean, I feel like my inclination would be just to get rid of it and then address it with her.
I mean,
Um,
I think intent matters. I think if you are screenshotting it because you want to have a discussion about it with your child and you want to make sure that you can truly address this issue without it being deleted with them, I don't know that that's a terrible parenting move. I
right.
don't I don't know that that's child pornography. If you if you're keeping it with the intent to distribute it or use it to blackmail, that matters, I think.
Oh, okay. So I see what you're saying. So I think I misunderstood. So if you're talking about the parent screenshotting the photo that their child took
Right.
for internal purposes, no, I don't think that is child pornography. It's definitely the distribution. I mean, like people have photos of their children. I mean, I grew up running naked through the sprinklers in my front yard, right? And I'm sure there's photos of that, and I'm sure my mom would be happy to show anyone who shows up at her house. That's not going to be child pornography, but I think once it gets distributed, right? Uh, and and again, I think intent to post is probably where it matters. So it's not. The question would be like, so if Kellyanne did in fact intend for it to be posted, that's probably enough, right?
And maybe even if she took it with the intent to use it against her daughter, that
Right,
might not be okay in and of itself.
right. Because again, she's a high profile figure, and we all know that celebrities get hacked. I mean, it's a kind of recurring thing that happens on the internet. Like every couple months, it's so and so. Nude photos get linked. I mean, it's like one of these things where if you're a celebrity at this point, you kind of know not to take those images on your iCloud account because people are actively trying to pursue them. Um, so you could argue that she kind of was reckless to an
Right.
extent. Now, the interesting, um, yeah, I mean, I how would you get to the bottom? I mean, I gotta imagine there's some kind of um, tech expert you could hire to figure out whether or not you were hacked, right?
Yeah, and going back, even the possession of
Yeah.
sexually explicit material of a minor might be illegal.
Yes, certainly. And that was kind of my point. If we're being honest, I think some of the differences in our answers may also, in fairness, result from gender. I think it's a very different thing, and I think most people will probably agree. But it seems to be a different thing. Like if a mom were taking a screenshot to have a conversation with her daughter versus like a dad doing it, it's just not something I would be comfortable with in a million years. Like, yeah, I wouldn't want to see the photo to begin with, right?
Yeah,
Uh, and I'd probably, again, I'd probably go to mom and be like, "Hey, you got to handle this."
sure.
So
Yeah,
maybe that occurred. I wonder. Nobody really ties George into any of this part of the conversation, which is interesting because what did he know? When did he know it? Right?
right.
Um,
And Claudia and her mother were at war. Were at
yeah,
war. Claudia was publicly saying, "Get me out of here. My mom's crazy. I've suffered years of abuse and trauma." And you can see where Kellyanne's intent in having this sexually explicit material of her daughter probably wasn't to have a nice discussion about how to use the internet appropriately. And so I could see her being held liable for simply keeping sexually explicit material of a minor.
right. I've been surprised for a while that they even let her post on social media, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
Um, which is always fascinating me because if um, again, there's two ways that you can look at this. Either it's, well, I guess there's three, right? Either it's true, either what she's saying is true, either what she's saying is not true, or it's kind of a mixed bag, I guess would be the third option. And if I had a child that was posting crazy things on social media, which is conceivable, I wouldn't let them post on social media anymore, right? And I think there's some element I kind of caught in the story. Like Claudia mentioned in her video that her mom regularly takes her, kind of implied that her mom regularly takes her phone. And that's why she thinks it was her mom, because this photo, as far as she was aware, was on her phone. And so she thinks her mom must have gotten it when she was checking her phone. The fact that her mom is checking her phone indicates that maybe they've had some kind of discussion about what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. But I, I mean, would you ever consider not allowing your kids to post on social media?
Yeah.
Okay. And how do you, what would that look like? I mean, how do you, let's say you gave one of your children a mandate, you, you, this isn't good for you, especially if they're going viral. Like thousands of people are seeing this, they're commenting on it. I mean, that's not something that like most adults are built to handle. I think for a 16-year-old, it would be very, um, very difficult,
Oh,
on
I
top
mean,
of everything
I
else
agree
they're
with
dealing
you.
with.
I have a
So
16-year-old. He hasn't always used social media appropriately because it's hard to teach kids how to use social media appropriately. So what do? I use my parental controls on my iPhone to turn off the app, to remove access to the app.
now, do you think that he's savvy enough to get around that? Like if you wanted to?
I mean, he would have to go get a new iPhone and set up a new anonymous Instagram account or TikTok. Now she may be able to do that. She seems like a savvy girl. But let's talk about um custody.
Right.
And Claudia has said, "Get me out of here. The state won't do anything." She is wanting the equivalent of CPS to come take her away from her parents. And we know that CPS has investigated And it seems that they have at least come to the conclusion that whatever's going on in that house does not rise to the level of unfitness or danger that would lead them to take custody of Claudia. Now, will you explain what that would mean? Like, what would it mean for the state to take custody of a 16-year-old child?
Yeah, I mean, you're really looking so this is not to discount emotional abuse, because emotional abuse is a very real and serious thing, but it's also difficult to prove, for obvious reasons. If there's physical abuse, um, there's usually physical, tangible evidence of that, and it's less subjective. Emotional abuse is kind of by its nature more subjective because, as you can imagine, different people react to different things. There's certainly a level where, regardless of who you are, you, your behavior is going to elicit a certain response. But it is more difficult to prove, right? And then there's neglect, right? So, which is also more objective, because there's going to be physical and tangible signs of neglect. Neglect would be like, leaving a child in a hot car, right? That is physically dangerous, and has resulted in a lot of deaths. Or not feeding somebody properly. Again, there's going to be physical signs of that. Leaving chemicals exposed, or drugs out, or guns out. These are all things that can have tangible physical, um, repercussions. Whereas emotional abuse, which is, I think, is really kind of, my understanding, and I could be wrong, was not that Claudia was claiming that her mother was physically abusive. Um, I think she was claiming that, her mother was kind of emotionally abusive. Is that accurate as far as you understand?
She did claim that her mother was physically abusive, and in at least one video, Claudia appears to slap, or Kellyanne appears to slap Claudia.
Right.
However, parents are allowed to physically discipline their children.
Right.
Having a parent who slaps you or is physically rough with you will not lead to the state taking custody.
You're right. In most cases, I think, right? Like, my message to, the corporal punishment thing comes up all the time in my cases. Um, my messaging on it almost always is just, look, you have a right to do it, but if it was me, I wouldn't do it, right?
Well,
Um,
and that's an important part because in family court, the standard for losing custody is not the same as it
right,
is to lose custody to the state.
right,
So I believe if George and Kellyanne were going through divorce proceedings, the allegations that Claudia is making would heavily weigh in, and Kellyanne could lose custody of her daughter. Asking the state to come in and take the daughter away from both parents and put her in a foster home is very unlikely without physical symptoms of abuse.
right. And also, I mean, so I guess it's important to know, like, I don't know how dependency actions work where she is. A dependency action is what we're talking about in terms of, like, the state coming in and removing, the child from the parents. Um, but here in Arizona, they almost always put, like, they develop a plan, right? So, a dependency action is filed because there's a problem. Maybe the child is removed from the home. The state would almost always prefer to pursue some kind of reunification path, or, kind of redemption arc. To see, the goal is almost always, again, it's not always, but the general goal is usually, to get the parents on track so they can have the children back. And so that looks like drug testing, that looks like domestic, violence and mental health counseling, that looks like, other parenting classes, education classes, a period of supervision. Basically, it is a very long road and a long list of hoops that you've got to jump through, but there's usually always initially a plan to say, if you do these things, we will let you have your kids back, right? So there's almost always this kind of redemption arc, and I think that would definitely be true in in this case, if we're talking about like slapping is a good example where maybe it's corporal punishment, maybe it's physical abuse. But if we're talking about one occasion, that
Mhm.
seems to be like something that if a parent was willing, that you could probably correct, or that the dependency process would want to try to correct through education, through oftentimes there's underlying issues in when parents act out this way, and so the state will also try to um, um, address those as well. So I agree that that's not likely to happen here, and the standards are different in a custody case.
The state is looking at minimally viable parenting, and it's hard to neglect a 16-year-old. A 16-year-old can't be left in a hot car, can feed themselves, can stay home alone. So are the parents minimally viable? You've got two high profile educated parents who are saying to the state, we've got a rebellious daughter who's fighting with us and we're dealing with parenting. This is our choice. And CPS, or their version of CPS, seems to be agreeing. And the police, while they've been to their house, might be investigating, but it doesn't seem that they're doing anything either. So Claudia is not likely to be rescued from the state.
Right. The other thing too is with anytime you have, I mean, I don't know what your thoughts on this as a parent. Again, I don't have kids, but like, um, I imagine any parent, especially with teenagers, if every single interaction was recorded, like as far as just say, I imagine there are moments in time where parents have regrets, or um, or wish they wouldn't want that to be shared publicly, and it's hard to distinguish between is this an everyday occurrence, like is this how life is in their household, or are they just hitting their breaking point, even if that's not like, personally I don't think that type of behavior is ever okay. But again, I don't have kids, so I but I've heard that they test your patience.
We all have moments that we are less than proud of.
Yeah.
All of us, all of us. No one is a perfect parent. But if the relationship and the dynamic is so negative that a child knows when to turn on the camera because things are about to get ugly, then you've got a dynamic that is really not okay. And let's say George came into your office and said, look, I've had it up to here. My wife and daughter are fighting all the time. I think I need a divorce. How would you advise George?
Well, first I'd figure out what his goals are, and I would try to center those goals on not what's going on between him and his wife, which at that point is probably pretty tense. Um, but what does he truly think is best for his daughter? And again, going back to the reasons why. So I would say he would have he. I mean, just from what's available publicly, he would have a very solid case for at least pursuing concerns about Kellyanne's parental fitness, and looking into that and investigating that. Um, the question is, does George truly believe that maybe restricting Kellyanne's time is best for his daughter? Does her time need to be supervised? Does it need to be limited? Is it overnight? Is it non-overnight? I mean, what is he really looking to get out of, not of the fight between the two of them, but what's best for his daughter? And I don't know. And he hasn't really said much, to be honest. They obviously are not getting a divorce, as far as we're aware. Um, and they both did when these things started. Not the recent incidents, but Kellyanne resigned in August, and George took a step down from his kind of public life with the Lincoln Project as well, and they both kind of vowed to minimize their social media presence. So they appear to me to be trying to work things out, but I think he could definitely. There are stones for him to uncover, and there may be on Kellyanne's side as well as far as George, but that's not really something that we've heard about. Right, his kind of claim to fame is just sandbagging Donald Trump, while his wife is like, uh, his right hand woman, so to speak. We haven't really heard anything tense as far as I'm aware of in terms of George um, and Claudia's relationship.
If,
But that
yeah,
doesn't mean it's not there.
right, right. On the face of it, with what we have, if George was sitting across from me, I would tell George that I feel fairly confident he may be able to get sole legal decision making.
Yeah.
The while the evidence that we have is not something that CPS would come in and take, custody over, with how Claudia feels and the fact that she's 16 and the evidence that she's put forth, there's plenty of evidence that the relationship between mother and daughter is so broken down and is so negative that if Claudia doesn't want to see her mother, George can probably get sole legal decision making. Do you agree?
Right. I do. I mean, if that's, and I think George is an interesting piece of this because again, there's only three people that have lived in this environment, and that's George, Claudia, and Kellyanne, right? So if he thinks, um, if he agrees with Claudia and he does think that Kellyanne is out of control, and abusive on a consistent and unhealthy basis, I think he's got all the leverage in the world to pursue that. But maybe he thinks that things are out of context. Maybe he thinks like it ultimately, I think if Kellyanne can be redeemed, the best thing for everyone is if these people get on the same page. So I would challenge him to think about that too. Is this something that's possible? Because um, either there's going to be conflict between Kellyanne um, and George, or there's not. And if he thinks there's going to be conflict, I think he has to pursue sole legal decision making. But if he thinks that they can stay on the same page, I mean, they've very clearly got a daughter who's going through a lot of stuff, whether it's her fault or not. And so ultimately, I think it's if you have two healthy, happy parents, that's the best thing for her. So I mean, I would challenge him to think about that. But he's the one that's there, and he's one that's observed everything. So I agree, he could definitely get sole legal decision making if he wanted to push for it.
So the other possibility in this case is, let's say George didn't want sole legal decision making. The other
Yeah.
possibility is that the judge could say, this child needs a best interest attorney to
Yes.
represent her interests in the family court. And it's possible that Claudia could end up having a real say in what happens to her, even if George doesn't care, which would be interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I think that would probably. Um, I mean, if I were a judge on this case, I want to get to the bottom of what's going on. And everyone, it seems like there's enough of a risk of bias and potential agendas that have nothing to do with the child's best interest, including maybe coming from the child. Who knows, right? It just the situation is confusing and bizarre, and I think having a best interest attorney um, is a good way to try to get to the bottom of that because the best interest attorney's job is not is to advocate for what's in Claudia's best interest, right? And they're neutral, and that doesn't necessarily mean doing what Claudia wants because letting you know um, letting a 16-year-old make decisions about their life is not per se always. They're not going to always do what's in their best interest. I mean, kids make stupid decisions all the time. So I think that if I were a judge, that's what I would want to have happen. So somebody that can try to untangle and get me a picture of what's going on because it could be in so many different directions. Um, and the other thing too for both of these parents, again, I'm not a. There's a couple, like I said, there's a couple different ways of looking at this, and we don't know what the reality is, other than that there's obviously an issue, right? It is not uncommon for certain teenagers to have behavioral issues. If both parents agree that that's what's going on in this case, um, or that there's an element of that, I mean, the reality is it's probably mixed bag of all of it. But I wouldn't I wouldn't necessarily want to deal with that on my own. You know what I mean?
Right.
Uh, so that's but you have to balance that with the best interest as well.
And sometimes what happens in family court is the family court will say, you have to change the way you parent. And this
Yes.
happens fairly often. So Kellyanne may feel like she's simply laying down the law and not allowing her rebellious teenager to get away with murder and get her to respect her authority. And Claudia may feel like that is psychological abuse. And the judge may say, Claudia, I understand that you love your daughter and that she's having behavior problems, but you can't call her names, you can't swear at her, and you can't slap her anymore. You have to change the way you parent. And this
Yeah.
happens a lot in family court.
Yep. There's often no corporal punishment orders, right? Where you're not going to be held criminally liable if you violate that, but you could be held in contempt. The court could reduce your parenting time or restrict it for violating that. Not necessarily going to throw you in jail, um, but the court's not. There's a fine line between what is legal and what is appropriate. And the family court is really a court of equity. They're trying to do what's best and what's equitable.
So let's talk about that. Let's say Kellyanne is our client, and Kellyanne feels like she's a great parent. And George lets Claudia get away with murder. And Claudia needs to spend more time with Kellyanne so that Kellyanne can teach her how to be an appropriate young woman.
Yeah.
What would happen then?
So I think Kellyanne would probably be the person I would be most, um, to me as a potential client. She seems like she would prevent the most interesting nuances and challenges. So I would be um, excited to hear from her. And I think I would know pretty quickly, having that kind of attorney-client relationship and getting that confidential information I think I'd be able to almost like fly on the wall, figure out kind of what's going on based on what she wants. Because I think that there's no doubt, regardless of what has occurred, even the worst of what's been said about her is true, there's a path to redemption for her if she employs the right strategy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so it would be curious to see if what her focus is, if she is focused on attacking her daughter,
Mm-hmm.
um, or if she's focused on basically addressing what's out there publicly, and maybe what's not out there publicly, but also privately, right? And because there's no doubt that she should be embarrassed about some of her behavior, right? And
Mm-hmm.
you can't make that go away. But is she willing to take accountability for what she's done, and then also take certain steps to provide assurance that she's not a danger to her child? And here's the context. Here's how I'm going to do better, right? Or does she feel like she's? Does she feel like? I could imagine a scenario where she feels like things have been totally misrepresented,
Yes.
um, and that would also be fun to go down the rabbit hole, because I can envision a scenario where that's true, um, and but then you get in a situation where you're potentially litigating against your daughter, which is interesting, and so there would be tough. She has, I think she has. Probably the easiest path to victory if she wants it, but also um, the most potential permutations, if that makes sense. So her position kind of would fascinate me.
That's very interesting because I think I would prefer to represent George.
Yeah.
I
And
think he has
I don't
the
mean,
easiest path to victory. And this happens a lot in our cases where sometimes you have a parent that is maybe more old school and they have parenting beliefs that are maybe different from what the court expects of them, but they're perfectly within their legal authority to discipline and parent their children in the way they see fit. This presents a difficult case when they feel justified and when they are not interested in having the court tell them how they need to behave.
yeah. And as I kind of reflect on what I just said, I want to make one thing clear, that everything I just said goes out the window if it comes out that she intentionally posted that nude photo. Like there's no coming back from that. So I was thinking about it, but like What I meant is like the videos of her screaming at her daughter.
Mhm.
I think you can come back from that if you not only message it right, but also like put actions behind that messaging
Mhm.
and show your work. My experience with most of the family court is that the court will take precautions when necessary, but they'll also almost always leave room for improvement,
Mhm.
and a path for a more positive result in the future.
Mhm.
And that's why I think her case
Mhm.
could be easy if she took if she said, yeah, I you know the way I responded in those videos was terrible, but it was a one, I was at my brink, whatever it is, right? And then she took ownership of that.
Well, you're
I
talking
think,
about taking accountability and buying in to what the court believes, which is you shouldn't parent your children that way. So she
yeah,
has two options. She can take accountability, say she's sorry, and do better, which is what society expects of parents now, or she could take the opposite approach. I know how to raise my daughter. She's out of control. You can't tell me what to do. And that is a dangerous position to take.
yeah, yeah, because there's at least some proof in the pudding so far, right?
Well, and the court
Um,
can tell you what to do. The court can put
yeah,
restrictions on how you parent. Um, and the consequences, like you said, they're not criminal, but they could be contempt. It could be loss of custody. It could be a lot of things.
yeah, and they don't have very much time left. I think one thing that's interesting that we haven't um, touched on at all yet is the the second video, um, where Claudia is kind of recanting. She says, "I don't think my mom did this on purpose. I think she was hacked. I don't want her to go to jail. We love like mothers and daughters, and we fight like mothers and daughters." I mean, the thing that's fascinating to me about that is I can see her video being authentic and genuine because I have seen and observed a lot of mother daughter relationships in that age range that are very very hot and cold and toxic. Um, but I can also see like the hostage video aspect of it, where like, okay, this child's being coached by her parents, right? And how do you determine which one it is? Um, without getting some kind of deeper involvement from a third party.
I completely agree with you. With this dynamic, you have to get some sort of court appointed advisor, some sort of therapeutic intervention, some sort of family assessment to figure out, is Claudia a difficult teenager with stubborn parents making their way through the world? Or is Claudia the victim of pretty terrible parents who are doing ongoing damage in the way they're parenting? One of those things is true, or something in the middle. And
Yeah.
and figuring it out is not something that we can do just based on these social media posts.
No. And does Claudia really, is she so unhappy in her situation that she wants to get actually removed? Because I'm sure there are lots of things about her life that are more privileged than others, right? Like, does she how does she feel about the alternative and the possibility about being placed in another home, right? And maybe
And
not having the level of access to certain privileges that she currently has. And again, that's not to discount, because it's not like privileged children or privileged people or wealthy people or celebrities can't have bad experiences and they can't be victims of abuse. That's absolutely true, but you have to. There's a lot of things going on, and does she really want to be removed from that home, or is she like, um, does she like the narrative, right?
well, it's
Um,
it's true. I mean, most of the time when teenagers are removed, if they don't have a family member to go to, they'll be placed in a group home with a
yeah,
pretty different standard of living and a complete loss of control. And that is probably a terrible outcome. So is there a family member she can go stay with? Is there a friend she can go stay with? Like, how do we develop a plan to actually help the family? Because being a family in the spotlight with two parents fighting publicly
Yeah.
while mom works for the Trump administration, and people are probably coming at Claudia due
Oh, I
to
can't
her
imagine being.
vicarious connections. It's a lot of pressure, and these people are under, a microscope and just a terrible amount of pressure.
I agree, and I think I am happy that they have, at least as far as what they put out publicly, that they have decided to withdraw from social media. It, as a family, so taking off the attorney hat, like if I were in this situation and I were trying to rebuild, that's exactly what I think would be appropriate. And to have some, I would be getting some serious counseling and therapy for everyone, and trying to process whatever has occurred, and build, move on from that in a healthy way. And I really hope that is what this family um, is is doing, right. And I hope it's not kind of more positional, but I mean, honestly, I would have gotten out of the public eye much sooner, uh, because I can't imagine that Claudia doesn't get bullied and stuff like that, um, because of everything that's gone on between her parents online.
Right,
You know?
right. It's
I
true.
mean,
Social media can make life a lot worse and a lot harder. And it's an interesting the role that social media has played in this particular family, although we do see it all the time in family court. And so I do think, as you said, if you're dealing with a lot of family drama and you're looking to make amends and build your family, taking a social media break can be maybe one of the best things you can do.
yeah, I mean, I'm not on Twitter or Instagram. I'm on Facebook, so I kind of moved on from it uh, a long time ago. But I don't see what value it's generating to to her life. And I'm sure she would tell me something about, freedom of speech, and I'm all for that. But like, again, there are certain things in life where you might have an opinion about something, and what, uh, you know, what ought to be legal, what ought to be allowed legally, but you wouldn't necessarily want your family member to 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 do those things, right? If that makes sense. Like,
It
there's a
does.
difference between what you can do and what you should do. And I just don't, because I know from my own experience, and I'm sure you do as well. You get a little bit of a dopamine hit when you post something, whether it's Facebook, or and you get all those likes, and you're like, wow, people are liking my post. It's a little bit of a rush, and that to me just seems really toxic in this particular situation.
With that, we have to wrap it up for this episode. Thank you, Darren. I can't wait until we hit our next juicy topic soon.
Sounds good.
Bye.